welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for July 1st, 2014. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today I'm joined by Jim Clausing online, and how are you, Jim?
Doing well. Been busy with forensics investigations and getting ready for the holiday.
All right, good for you. Joined here in the in our lounge studio, whatever you want to call it, with John Hogoboom. And John, preparing for the holiday as well?
Yeah, and we've got some interesting activity coming in the following week, which maybe we'll discuss on next week's program, but hopefully not.
Hopefully not. Okay, good. And also joined by Matt Kaiser here. And how are things going with you, Matt?
Oh, I'm keeping busy.
Keeping
busy.
busy.
Better believe it. Yep.
We're all keeping busy. We're a relatively small team and a big company here, so we always have something to do and always are interested in sharing with you. I'm Brian Rexroad, and today what we're going to talk about first, I guess we've seen some activity, we've been reporting on activity related to brute force attacks and RDP. We're going to yet do that again today when we talk about the internet weather, but John, there was something that came out from Kaspersky on this.
Right, so Kaspersky released a report basically saying that they recently added into part of their tool set the ability to detect remote desktop protocol brute force attacks, which a brute force attack is when a specific IP address is repeatedly trying to password guess its way into a system. Mm-hmm. And so they recently added this into their tool set to detect it. Lo and behold, they discovered, wow, there's a lot of this going on, which really isn't a surprise to us. We've kind of been reporting this off and on for the past several years. Mm-hmm. We know that not only are there actors out there who are specifically trying to get into remote desktop servers, but there's other worms out there, like the Morto worm is still out there, taking over machines. And it even has a very small list of usernames and passwords it uses, but it's the law of supply and demand. If there's enough of them out there, eventually you'll hit one of them that's got a weak password and get in. Mm-hmm. So I guess the interesting things or things that they noticed from their analysis, and maybe this is because Kaspersky is a Russian company, that most of the activity that they saw was picked up from Russia and the United States. I think there was one, I think it was Turkey maybe, somewhere around there, was like the next highest. And then some of the other European countries kind of filled out the rest, but in the large part, US and Russia accounted for most of the brute force RDP type activity they saw. I took a quick slide to look at our activity, and you might have one as well. I don't know if you did this for our weather report, but it kind of shows, this is a 2-year scan, so this is a pretty long term. And like I said, we've been talking that for many years that RDP has been scanned continuously. And this is the number of scans. So we're seeing around between 2,000 to 3,000 on a daily basis, regular scanning. There was a noticeable dip, which I backtracked that to pretty recently, 5/14/2014, so it was about a month and a half ago. I didn't get a chance to figure out why that was, why that significant dip. It actually decreased by maybe a 2/3 or so. It's about a third of what it actually used to be. But I'm not sure why that is.
Right.
I wouldn't rest on your laurels. I would still protect all my RDP machines, or probably not have them on the internet if I could avoid it, or certainly block or filter access to them, because that type of stuff is devices you don't want people to get into.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable to point out here as well that you're looking at scan sources here, which is not necessarily an indicator of how many probes that you might get. And once they find an accessible RDP server, it does not indicate how many times you're going to actually try to hit that device. Although the number of source addresses does have some kind of a bearing on how well they can hide the fact that it's the same actor coming in perhaps multiple times. What you want a system to do is, after a few guesses, lock them out. Well, they're going to generally be locked out by IP address. If they've been locked out by IP address and come back, with another of maybe a few thousand in the repertoire, they can get an awful lot of guesses in before they're actually locked out.
Right.
So that's one of the threats associated with these botnets performing these brute force attacks, is that it gives them an awful lot of opportunity to do things, and they could be even hitting the same server in parallel.
And I think from what I understand, or what I remember, RDP by default does not have any kind of back off kind of thing, or after a certain number of invalid attempts, it doesn't really stop you. So they can kind of keep going on and on.
Right. So you have to
trying.
do something in front of it. And to protect it.
So, long story short, we say this all the time, filter access to your RDP servers, use strong passwords. Most of these are using, password lists that are relatively simple to guess, and that's where they have the most success. So the more complex your password is, the better. And certainly filtering access to only the people who need to access that device is the way to go.
Absolutely. And it's a little difficult to see on this graph, but we had observed earlier that the amount of drop that you observed on May 15th or May 14th was right around the same amount of drop. We saw a little bit of a hole in activity back in right around the beginning of November, late October.
Right around November. You can kind of see that
2013.
sliver in there still, but it's a little bit harder when I got the 2-year chart up.
What that suggests to me is it's basically one actor set that's associated with that particular set of activity. That's a reasonable proportion of the activity is a particular actor set, a botnet, perhaps they lost command and control, the system's down for a little while, they're working on recovering it. In this case, since it's persisted for a little bit, perhaps maybe there was some kind of a takedown or something that we're not acutely aware of at the moment, or maybe they've gone on, off to look for something else.
Right.
All right, good deal. I understand Microsoft has taken an action to get a little bit of a handle on some of this activity we've been seeing with dynamic DNS. Can you tell us a little more about it, Matt?
Yep. So this is actually kind of interesting. We found out about it a little bit earlier than most people because we were looking at DNS queries related to dynamic DNS domains, and things started resolving very strangely as of about midday yesterday to a bunch of IPs that had host names that were owned by Microsoft. And so it turns out that Microsoft took action against two particular types of malware. They call them Bindi and Jenkskus, and it took me forever to memorize those names. But we know them better as NJRat and NJWorm. So what they did is they filed suit against two of the purported actors behind the malware, as well as taking action and seizing domains owned by noip.org. Now, noip.org is a very well-known dynamic domain provider. It's free for most people. They have a paid service as well, but most people take advantage of the free domains. You sign up for them. Maybe there's a client, and you tell it what your IP address is, and the domain will resolve to you until you change it.
Right.
Unfortunately, it's also, as most dynamic DNS free services are, rife with abuse. Malware authors use it all the time. In particular, NJRat and NJWorm were using it for command and control. The upshot of the takeover of the domains, however, is that not only were the domains in particular that were identified as being part of NJRat and NJWorm use, not only were they taken over, but the entire, I think it was a list of 22 domains that were owned, everything under those was repointed to Microsoft. And it seems like the majority is being dropped on the floor. It's not resolving. I had heard that the intent originally was that they would be filtering out the known malicious traffic and passing the rest on as a complete transparent redirect. It doesn't seem to be the case, and there are some people on the internet, and when I say some, it might be in the millions. Just some.
Yeah, there's obviously, it appears to be some collateral impact associated with this this takedown activity, but at the same time, we have seen an awful lot of cases where dynamic DNS services, a lot of these free services, are being run in a way that, perhaps not with as much scrutiny as necessary to really keep from being abused or malicious activity being, taking place. And in fact, we've seen in some cases where it appears that hosting services, for example, are willing to accept things without really paying any attention to really what's going on. And so there's a balance here that needs to take place. And and this is a case where apparently there are some consequences to the attempt to clean things up, and hopefully they'll get those things resolved. But perhaps on the other side of this is sending a message to these free service providers that they really need to be paying attention to what they're doing and making sure that their services aren't being abused.
Yeah, the fact of the matter is that dynamic DNS is heavily used by a number of threat actors, not just the ones involved with this particular malware activity, but we've seen it all over the place. We've seen it heavily used in APT as well.
Right, absolutely.
And it actually did interfere with about 25%. 25% of the activity that was disrupted was APT oriented.
Right.
Other APT, not to say that NJRat and NJWorm have some APT underpinnings, but there's a lot of other things hanging out in the noip.com space that were APT as well. Other APT groups kind of hang out in there that were collaterally impacted by this. Not to say that that's a bad thing, It's just an observation as well.
Yeah, you know, this is only sort of peripherally related, but there was actually a study done by the Government Accounting Office. I don't know why they in particular picked this out, but this was several years ago, where they were looking at the registry information or registration information associated with domain names, and found that about 30% of them had bogus information. That is completely, phone numbers that didn't make any sense, addresses that aren't real, names that didn't exist, no contact information that was valid, email addresses that don't work. And so, some of that would be erroneous, and that is, it was just simply a mistake. But a good proportion of that is they didn't, there isn't really any scrutiny associated with this. So I think this fits in that sort of that same category. That is, really DNS, domain names, really are a significant underpinning in terms of translating, to IP addresses, and the abuses of those can have implications in terms of security of systems, because we're using that as a means for that translation. So I think the underlying message here is that it is important to have good security around DNS, whether it be a dynamic DNS service, whether it be a free service or a paid service. We still need to be paying attention to it.
I agree 100%. It's we've seen a lot of these actors taking advantage of it. There are legitimate uses for it too, that in this case, are collateral damage.
And they aren't the only ones. There's plenty of other dynamic DNS providers out there. So
this is, in my opinion, this is one example of a number that are potentially contributing. In fact, it appears that even some of them might be hosted for the specific purpose of being able to facilitate some of the malicious activities that we've seen, and unfortunately not necessarily in a position where U.S. legal action would be able to be taken against those. But you take action where you can. Next item here, we talked a little bit about APT, and John, I guess you found some information that maybe you can tell us a little about it.
So Symantec was reporting on this particular story about a threat called Dragonfly / Energetic Bear, it's APT group. And it's an interesting one. We've kind of talked about APT actors before a lot on the program. Most of them with respect to theft of intellectual property, espionage activity, intelligence gathering types of operations. This one was, for the most part, targeting different types of infrastructure. If you take a look at the types of things that they were targeting here, they're targeting, well, defense and aviation is one that we see all the time, but more so lately they were targeting energy grid operators, electricity generation, petroleum pipelines, and energy industrial control systems. That's the thing that really troubles me, mostly in US and Europe. It has a lot of similarities in some ways to Stuxnet with the ICS, the industrial control systems, but probably not the same actor set here, I don't think. The tactics that they were using, very similar to what we've seen before. They spearfish the targets that they want to get access to, and then try to interrogate their machines to figure out what kinds of systems they have access to, what types of devices are they connected to that might be an industrial control system or software on there, things of that nature. They also saw them using watering hole attacks, which is not uncommon for APT groups, where they have a watering hole for a site that these users might go to that might be energy related or whatever in their business that they're part of. And then when they get there, it redirects them to an exploit kit, which we see a lot with even traditional malware. But we've seen that a little bit more with APT, where they're using exploit kits as a means to get an infection to drop on there, and then they might upgrade that infection to something a little bit more useful for their purposes. The one really interesting thing about this one is that they were Trojanizing legitimate software for 3 vendors of ICS software. So they were actually able to Trojanize version of software up on various sites for these 3 particular manufacturers, so that they could kind of get into the systems in that way.
So they were able to actually get into the legitimate download sites associated with these vendors?
From what I understand, yeah. So that's pretty interesting that they were able to do that. They're also thinking that, well, they're pretty sure this is coming out of Russia. They don't know if it's a state-sponsored activity. There's speculation about that. The other couple of artifacts here is that they use the Havix rat, which is a rat that I don't know if we've talked about on the show before, but it's been around for a while. It's another remote administration toolkit, and it also goes by the name Backdoor Old Drea. And there's another tool that they'll also deploy, maybe after have Xtract, called Karagini, which also allows you to collect intelligence on the machine. It's a kind of a RAT, but it's more of an intelligence gathering type of thing. And their C2 infrastructure, very much like what we've seen before, compromised servers, mostly web servers, some of those popular blogging types of software that you can get and deploy on your web server. They found compromises for those, and they've used them as part of that. I did put up a slide here with some mitigation strategies. We talk about this all the time. The first thing I say, don't assign users local admin privileges, which we talk about a lot. Have them log in as an unprivileged user if you can, because if they can compromise the machine and have local admin privileges, it's really easy to escalate and start doing some domain level type things.
It's one of the layers of security. First, you control access to the system, and then within the system, you control access to aspects of the system, and it's all beyond that. So it's we should be working on layers of security in any of our security strategies.
Right. And if for some reason you can't restrict the local admin rights, at least have the browser run with some very least privileges, because most of the, as we mentioned, the watering hole attacks, they use exploit kits through the browser, try to compromise the machine. So the least privilege that the browser can have, the less likely it'll be able to infect the machine. And then really, in my opinion, the three important things here out of this slide is education. Educate your users on safe browsing habits. Educate them on how to open email safely. Don't open attachments or click on URLs from unknown sources when you get an email. Think before you click or open. And also, educate your users just in general on social engineering and phishing techniques that are going around. Because there's other types of techniques, not necessarily with APT, but we talked about phone ones too, where people call you on the phone and say, "Oh, there's a problem with your machine. We detected there's some kind of problem," and they try to steer you to browse to a website, and then they can take control of your machine that way too. So there's a couple other things
I'd stick one in there. If you do find something that's suspicious, make sure you report it to folks in your organization that can assess whether others have received something similar, because oftentimes it is spear phishing, but they are still generally sending to more than one individual. There may be two or three, but the opportunity to know that there's something suspect out there and investigate whether others have gotten it, investigate whether it has shown up and it has actually been followed out into or could have infected machines, is a very valuable tip for security analysts like ourselves in investigating events like this. Absolutely.
And I guess just to sum it all up, the reason this one maybe is a little bit more important than some other ones is they're kind of focused on industrial control systems, specifically in the energy sector. And while they haven't seen any type of bad behavior here, beyond the espionage aspects, there's a lot of potential for sabotage there, and we don't know what the motivation is. So that's one to kind of keep an eye on. And if you are in the energy sector, I would definitely take a look at some of these reports. We have a couple of links that we'll have on the show here, and there's one from Trend Micro, I believe it was, that actually has a really good analysis of some of this stuff. So.
One other thing I'd suggest, especially with the industrial control systems, is that they need to be, isolated from the rest of your network. You don't want normal browsing from those. You don't want, to the extent possible, you don't want folks to be able to reach them from their desktops, even on the corporate network. These are sensitive assets, and they need to be protected as such.
Yep. Good point, Jim, and I think we've probably talked about a similar topic related to point-of-sale systems in the past. That would be another example of that sort of thing. And I think more generally, we spend a lot of time talking about criminal activities, a little bit about APT, and as you pointed out earlier, John, it tends to have been traditionally thought about in terms of technology theft, intellectual property theft, that type of thing. But it is reasonable to expect that, this, as much as we like to think about the world getting smaller and being global, there are still countries with interest in protecting themselves, and you can expect that they're going to be investigating ways to help protect themselves, and one way is to have an upper hand, the opportunity to be able to do sabotage in other countries if they were to take some type of military action against them, or at least use it, at the very least, use it as a diplomatic hammer.
Bargaining
Is there
chip.
such thing as a diplomatic hammer? Is that an oxymoron? But the point being is that we can expect that that sort of thing is going to take place. So for anybody that's managing systems that have critical infrastructure roles, and I know we think of ourselves in that role as well, we need to be paying attention to what types of things might be taking place, even though they have not been sort of mainstream, what things might be taking place to try to gain control of systems or be able to manipulate systems in ways that certainly might not have a good monetary motivation, but might have a political motivation behind it.
Right.
So let's see, shift over to Jim here, and Jim, you were going to tell us about how bugs don't go away.
Yeah, Brian, this one came to our attention via the Security Mouse blog. LZO compression algorithm, Lempel-Ziv Oberhumor, it's been around since 1994. It's one of the most efficient compression algorithms out there, used in a lot of software, and it turns out that there's a rather subtle buffer overflow type bug in there that has gone unnoticed until just recently. It's a really subtle bug. Folks didn't notice it, and it was in the initial reference implementation of the algorithm. So a lot of other folks have, even though they've re-implemented their own version of the algorithm, most of it is based on that same initial reference implementation. So a lot of them ended up copying the same bug into their implementations. Not going to go into a lot of detail. You can read the blog post to get some more detail on exactly what happened. But since this LZO library is incorporated in lots of other software, each implementation of it needs to be fixed to correct their issues. It could potentially have a fairly large impact. In some implementations, it's possible to do remote code execution via this buffer overflow. In most, it's possible to do a denial of service. In most 64-bit architectures, it's impractical to actually do it, just because of the size of the buffer that they have to overflow there. But it's like I said, it's a tricky one, it's a subtle one, and so if a lot of people weren't reading the code, it's one that has hung around for 20 years until somebody new happened to look at the code with fresh eyes and noticed there was an issue there.
Yeah, and I think fundamentally this is a case where a good example where a bug, subtle or not, a bug can sit around for a significant period of time, and I think that's one of the reasons we have 0 days that occurs, that you can have bugs that are latent in systems, and if somebody is able to accumulate knowledge of these vulnerabilities in a malicious sense and develop exploits against those, that's where our 0 days are coming from. So, and I think sort of another subtlety that's associated with this is that personally, I'm much more of an advocate of looking at protecting systems from a threat point of view as opposed to focusing on trying to protect against vulnerabilities, because this is a case where the vulnerability may be there, it may have been around for a very long time, there's little that you can do about it if you don't know about it, there's no patch available. Whereas if you look at what motivations might exist to attack your systems, the methods that might be used to attack your systems, not specifically the exploit, but the behaviors and the activities associated with those, I think you have a much better opportunity to actually protect those systems in a reasonable way. We also talked a little bit about layers of security earlier as well, so that you want to try to not expose this type of bug in the first place and be able to protect your systems without depending on one layer of security to do that. So.
There are patches available for this now, and for the reference implementation. So all of the vendors, I'm sure, will be updating their libraries and their software, and I'm sure you'll see new packages, new versions of a lot of the vulnerable software coming out soon.
All right, thanks, Jim. And so let's go to, I guess, is this a good news story here, Matt? We've got a...
Oh, I think it's very good news, actually. I was very excited.
All right, well, tell us.
So Virus Bulletin has been around for 25 years. And if you haven't heard of them, they publish a bulletin. It's somewhere between a malware analysis paper and other articles relating to security. And for a long time, it was a paid-only subscription. And as of, I think today, today when we're taping, it's completely free. They're going to stop publishing a paper version of it, and it's going to be internet only. I assume that means ad-supported. And you won't even have to sign up for an account. You can just browse, and all of the back issues are there. And I think that's going to be where I'm going to be spending my 4th of July weekend, is reading up on the old back issues of Virus Bulletin.
All right.
So I think it's great if anyone's out there who wants to learn more about it and pick up some very well-written articles. That's the place.
Yeah, absolutely. This is actually, I think, very good news. Now, it was a subscription-based service previously, and like you said, you presume that they're going to an ad-based model, so there'll be advertising that's facilitating the monetization of that. So they do have an intent to continue with new articles as well.
Publishing articles instead of on a bulletin-wise basis. That'll be practically any time that they come out, like pretty much a blog format at this point.
So that would help in terms of the dynamics that are necessary to be able to, keep up with the amount of new developments that are taking place these days as well.
And whatnot.
Exactly.
All right, very good. So it's always nice to have some good news, and hopefully we have, well, at least not some bad news associated with internet weather for this week. But we certainly have continuing activity that we'd like to share with you here. First of all, this is packets, actually bytes and packets associated with port 161 UDP. This is actually source port 161 UDP. That's SNMP, Simple Network Management Protocol. As we've been reporting over and over again, this is one of many UDP-based protocols that can be used for reflection attack activity, that is denial of service attacks by reflecting off of these servers. We are continuing to see that activity. I think the trend here is that we're seeing more density, that is more cases of attacks that are using SNMP, but they're still not what I would describe as, really big attacks, looking at it from a telecommunications carrier's point of view.
Yeah.
If you're the victim of one of these attacks, they could be actually quite big. So they're up in the orders of hundreds of megabits per second, and like I said, more density of this sort of attack taking place. So I think fundamentally, regardless of this port or others, if you have any need to keep your service up and operating, you want to make sure that you have prepared a DDoS defense strategy or a service provider that can help you with that. Next item here, an anomaly we identified associated with scam probes on port 27016 UDP. This one appears to be innocuous, and I think, Matt, you reported on this last week, is that correct?
I noticed it last week. I don't think I reported on it.
Okay, so we, I like to report some things that are anomalies, but yet are not security issues. So this was one case here. It did show up on the radar. This is associated with gaming service activity. This time of year, you'd expect kids are getting out of school, good time to release some new games and capture their interest. They're probably enjoying the air conditioning and the gaming at this point. So this is actually appears to be innocuous activity. But if you do see this on your enterprise, obviously you want to be considering whether it's gaming activity or something else that's taking place, and if that's within your policy.
I think the Steam summer sale might be responsible for a good amount of that traffic as well. A whole bunch of games went on sale, and I know myself and a couple other analysts, we bought a few games.
Oh, so you're going to be sharing time between reading Virus Bulletin and
playing some games. All right, I'll admit it.
Okay. And okay, next item here is scan sources and probes on port 8081 TCP. And I happen to be showing scan sources here because I thought it was the sort of the most interesting to take a look at. And this is a case here where we obviously have some mechanized activity that is, it appears to be basically daily probing activity with some space in between. There are some exceptions to that. And most of the probes here, as well as the sources, are from China. There are some from US as well as Poland. This is not a case where the vast majority of the probes are from China. This is a case where most of the sources are from China, and it's sort of competing with the other probing activity that's taking place. But nevertheless, probing activity on port 8081 TCP, which is, I think, an alternate port, or used often for proxy port, right?
Right. There's a lot of other web services that use that as a port as well.
Right.
As like an alternate web service. Yeah.
Next one here is scan probes on port 53 TCP. This is associated with DNS as well as port 53 UDP, but we typically see more of the activity on UDP associated with DNS. This one, TCP, is generally used for zone transfers, and we have seen some indications, perhaps, had some discussions where perhaps there's somebody that's going around probing and trying to do zone transfers. I suspect it's more of a sort of survey the internet kind of thing, or get a mapping of the internet type of activity that's taking place. Normally you want zone transfers to be restricted on DNS servers, but I'm sure that there are plenty of them out there that haven't been restricted. And one of the consequences here is that, intentional or not, it could load down the server trying to do these zone transfers when you're expecting a query here and there, and all of a sudden you're asking it, have a system asking for everything that the DNS server knows.
Right.
Next item here is scan probes on port 623 UDP, and this is associated with ASF RMCP, and to translate that, that's basically the Alert Standards Format Remote Management and Control Protocol. And basically, this is a protocol that's used to manage PCs regardless of the stated operating system. So you're not dependent on the system being booted. It gives you some capability to go in and manage the system, perhaps tell it to boot, some things of that sort. I included a reference here, which is a document. I just happened to pick this up from searching around on what this protocol is about. This happens to be an HP document for how to use that protocol in managing HP computers, but there are lots of other manufacturers that have similar capabilities. Now, what's interesting here is the same sources that are probing this port, and this is relatively new activity. I'm showing 60 days of activity here, so it's basically been going on the last few weeks or so. But the same sources that are probing this one are also probing on port 123 UDP, 161 UDP, and 1900 UDP, all of which we have discussed previously associated with potential ports for use in DDoS attacks, that is reflection type DDoS attacks, having amplification value associated with them.
Potentially, certainly NTP 123 UDP was well used earlier in the year for reflection DDoS activity.
Right. So now this activity, most of what we've seen here so far has been associated with a sort of a trusted and known security researching organization. And so I consider this to be somewhat or mostly innocuous at this point, but there certainly is possibility for others that would be searching for the same type of capability. I'm not sure at this point how successful whether lots of these have been exposed or accessible, but there are two potential consequences. One is use of this port for DDoS attack activity. The second one will be potentially to be able to get unauthorized access to computers that have this capability exposed.
We've talked several times in the last few months about the potential for port 1900, but we hadn't actually seen any attacks on that. And so I guess it's now time to look at this protocol and see what the reflection capabilities are there, even though we haven't seen any attacks on it yet.
Yeah, I think you're right, Jim.
I actually have maybe I'll present something on that. You can reflect quite a bit with 1900 UDP.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Not sure that we want to advertise that, but it is possible. I have some proof of case samples of how to do that.
Okay. All right, next item here, top 10 most probed ports, and at the top of the list here we see port 22 TCP, no surprise there. We see 135 TCP, and again, this one's still ranking second. I think, Matt, you last week reported that there was a drop in that activity. We're going to take a look at that again and show where it stands at this point. 1433 TCP, that's Microsoft SQL database. 445 TCP, of course, we still have those config infections out there. 3389 TCP, we talked about that with the remote desktop protocol. Already got a chance to take a look at the last 2 years of activity and probing on that one. Next here, port 53 UDP, obviously looking for those DNS servers that could potentially be used for reflection attacks. Port 80 TCP. 5900 TCP, we haven't seen that one in a little while, kind of came back here. It's associated with VNC, again, remote desktop protocol capability, and then last but not least, the 8080 TCP. Now, again, as I said, taking a look at the scan probes on port 135 TCP here, you can see what's been happening over the last 60 days. One of the theories was that there was a particular ID that was being checked for, and they were basically scanning the whole internet to see if that ID existed on any of the computers that were exposed.
It was strange. We looked at some of the packets related to this and couldn't really. I don't know if we know exactly what they were looking for, but they were trying to administratively connect with a particular set of credentials, which would be surprising that you'd randomly happen across a machine that would accept those credentials.
It didn't appear to be a legitimate activity at the very least. So this sort of activity is certainly still taking place. I think when you reported it last week, Matt, there was a sort of a lull in the activity. It's still there at a lower level than we had seen previously, about half as many probes, but still a significant number on an hourly basis. Looking at the top 10 most sources doing the probing, we have at the top of the list, and actually this one jumped up significantly since last week, port 443 TCP, and we're going to take a little closer look at that in a few moments here. Next is port 445 TCP, followed by 23 TCP, which is, again, no surprises there. Port 80 TCP, 8080 TCP, and then we talked a little bit about 27016, 27015 is on here as well. Also 3128 TCP, which is also often used as a gaming port.
Proxy, actually.
Proxy?
Yeah, Squid Proxy, 3128.
Okay. Squid Proxy, that's right. I think it does have some gaming association as well, but I think you're probably correct in the sense that it's associated with Squid Proxy. Taking a look at the scan sources on port 443 TCP, this is HTTPS, and this is actually showing, I think, 60 days of activity here. And the significance here is that we talked about this when this activity was up back in the April timeframe, continuing into May. And we had identified that most of the sources that are doing this probing activity, and this is up around 9,000 sources at the peak here, what this appears to be is some sort of a scanning activity to recruit devices into a botnet, and you can see the growth of the botnet size as we progress here. And as I said, it appeared to be some sort of a systemic problem out of Argentina, where a lot of devices were being recruited in that botnet. It stopped. We're not sure why it stopped. Perhaps command and control was taken down or something along those lines, or perhaps it was diverted to do something else. But does not appear that botnet has gone away. In fact, it seems to be the same, at least originating from the same place, the same sort of sources that are participating in this scanning activity, except in this case there was no ramp up. So it suggests that the botnet was basically healthy, perhaps idle, perhaps doing something else, and is still going strong.
It's interesting the way that you've got that curve starting, earlier on in the graph. I would almost extrapolate to say, right? You could connect those and say the botnet's been there the whole time. It's even been growing at the same rate potentially, and then it just got switched back on.
Yeah, that's a good possibility as well. Absolutely. Okay, so that's our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at threattrack@list.att.com. And if you'd like to get notice of new episodes, you can follow us on Twitter. It's @ThreatTraq. The ThreatTraq video is available on att.com/ThreatTraq. That's the ATT Tech channel. It's also available on YouTube at the ATT Tech channel within YouTube. There's also an audio-only version available on iTunes. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Thank you, John. Thank you, Matt. And thank you, Jim. Wish you well over the 4th of July holiday here. We'll be back next week with a new episode, and until then, keep your network safe.